For 7 days, Adrian Lowe disappeared from the 43rd floor, and no one in the building recognized him. Not the security team at the front desk, not the regional directors who had sat across from him in quarterly reviews, not the floor supervisors who CC'd him on every complaint email they never expected him to read. He had spent 11 years building Low Crest Hospitality into a company with 62 hotels across 14 states, and in that time he had apparently become something everyone knew about, but very few people had actually seen: a name on a letterhead, a voice on a call, a framed photograph in the lobby of the corporate offices in Denver, Colorado, that most employees walked past the way they walked past fire extinguishers. That suited what he needed to do. The letter that changed everything had arrived on a Thursday afternoon, folded inside a plain white envelope with no return address. 3 pages, handwritten, from a woman named Estelle Price. Estelle had worked as a housekeeper at the Low Crest's flagship hotel for 16 years. She had not written to complain about her schedule or her pay, though both, Adrian would later learn, deserved complaint. She had written because she did not know what else to do. She described a culture of systematic humiliation. Maintenance staff being called out by name in front of guests when something broke. Housekeeping schedules built around checkout times that corporate kept pushing earlier. Making clean rooms physically impossible without cutting corners. Then blaming the housekeepers when guest reviews mentioned dirty bathrooms. She described an HR process that felt less like protection and more like a recording system designed to build a file against anyone who asked the wrong question. And at the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that had gone slightly uneven, she had written, "Mr. Lowe, I don't think you know what this place feels like from the rooms nobody sees." Adrian had read the letter twice that Thursday evening, sitting alone in his apartment 2 blocks from the Denver office. Then he called his operations director and told him he would be unreachable for the following week. He did not explain why. On Monday morning, at 6:45, a man named Ed Ferris arrived at the Low Crest Denver flagship for his first day as a temporary maintenance associate. He wore steel-toed boots and a dark gray uniform with his name stitched above the breast pocket. He carried a radio on his belt and a laminated badge clipped to his collar. He had grown a short beard over the weekend, which he understood was not much of a disguise, but he also understood that people see what they expect to see. A man in a maintenance uniform mopping a hallway becomes part of the building. He stops being a person with a face and becomes a function. Adrian had counted on that, and within 2 hours of arriving, he understood just how right he had been. Nobody looked at him. Not the front desk staff arranging morning check-ins behind the marble counter. Not the food and beverage manager who walked past him in the corridor near the employee entrance, talking loudly into his phone about comping a guest's minibar. Not the assistant general manager, Patrick Hollis, who Adrian had promoted into that role 14 months ago, and whose name Adrian had approved on 3 separate performance reviews. Patrick walked past Ed Ferris twice in the first hour without any flicker of recognition, which told Adrian 2 things. Patrick was not paying attention to the people working under him, and Adrian himself had grown even more invisible than he realized. The trainee orientation began at 8 in the ground floor conference room. 22 new hires, most of them hired for front desk, guest relations, and food service positions. They came in carrying folders and the careful posture of people who understood they were being evaluated. Adrian positioned his cart near the corridor outside the glass wall and began wiping fingerprints from the panels while he listened. The trainer, a woman named Jolynn Farr, was efficient and polished. She moved through slides about company values with the practiced ease of someone who had said these words so many times they had become a kind of music familiar and automatic. Guest experience is our North Star. Every team member contributes to the whole. Respect and inclusion are not just policies, they are our culture. Adrian kept wiping. By mid-morning, one of the trainees, a young man in a trim charcoal blazer named Reese Calloway, had already positioned himself as the person Jolene would direct her best follow-up questions toward. He answered quickly, built on whatever Jolene said, and had a way of summarizing other people's contributions that subtly erased the original contributor and replaced them with a cleaner version of the thought that sounded more like Reese. Adrian recognized the technique. He had watched it in boardrooms for years. It was effective precisely because it never looked deliberate. Then he noticed her. She was not standing near the coffee station with the others during the first break. She was near the window at the far end of the corridor, reading something on her phone with the focused expression of someone doing actual preparation work and not catching up on messages. She wore a white collared shirt tucked into dark slacks. Her shoes looked practical. Her name tag read Soren Avery, Trainee Program, and beneath that, a small detail Jolene's presentation had glossed over entirely. She had transferred from the Loeb Crest property in Billings, Montana, where she had spent 2 years working front desk while finishing a hospitality management degree at night. Adrian's cart had rolled to a stop near the window side of the corridor while he was untangling a knot in the mop cord. He had not intended to stop near her, but she glanced up from her phone and, without hesitating, moved a standing display sign that had been sitting directly in the path of his cart. "Sorry," she said, "that was in your way." He looked at her. She had already turned back to her phone, not waiting for gratitude, not performing the gesture for anyone watching. She had just moved the sign because it was in the way. "Thanks," he said. She looked up again briefly. "Of course." Then Jolene called everyone back inside. Adrian stood in the corridor for a moment after the door closed, one hand resting on the cart handle. He watched Soren Avery take a seat at the far left of the training table, away from Reese Calloway and the small cluster forming around him. She opened a notebook, a physical one, and wrote something at the top of the page. He turned back to the corridor and pushed the cart toward the service elevator. Something about that small, unremarked gesture had settled in the back of his mind like a stone dropping into still water. He had not felt the ripples yet, but he knew they were there. Soren Avery had not come to Denver expecting kindness to cost her anything. She had spent 2 years at the Billings property working the kind of shifts that required patience more than skill. Early mornings, late nights, holiday weekends when the hotel filled with families who were kind and business travelers who were not. She had learned the check-in system, the loyalty program, the careful language for delivering bad news about room availability without making the guest feel it was their problem. She had also learned, more quietly, how to spot the patterns that made a hospitality operation either hold together or quietly fall apart, which supervisors had the genuine trust of their team and which ones had only compliance, when a process made logical sense, and when it only looked like it did on paper. She had applied for the Denver flagship trainee program because Denver was where the decision-making happened. The Billings property was fine, but fine was not where she needed to be. Her younger sister, Becca, had started community college in the fall on a partial scholarship that covered tuition but not housing, books, or the particular category of expenses that fall outside every financial aid form. Soren had 3 months of savings. She needed this program to lead somewhere real before those 3 months turned into a conversation she did not want to have. So she paid attention. She took notes. She studied the training materials before sessions and reviewed them after. She arrived early and stayed through cleanup. She also noticed things that were not in the training materials at all. She noticed that Reese Calloway always positioned himself closest to Jolene Farr during discussions. Not because he was physically the most interested, but because proximity to authority was something he managed the way other people managed their inbox. She noticed that 2 of the other trainees, a pair who had arrived together and laughed together at every break, were copying each other's assessment responses word for word on the shared drive and had not yet been called on it. She noticed that the maintenance associate who worked the corridor outside the training room, a quiet man with careful eyes whose badge said Ed Ferris, was routinely spoken to by trainees and managers the way people speak to furniture they have decided not to sit on. She also noticed that he never seemed flustered by it, which meant either he was very patient or he was used to it, and she suspected the answer was both. On Tuesday afternoon, the trainees broke into teams for the first major project, a proposal to improve guest retention metrics at the Denver property through changes to the loyalty program and front desk experience. Soren had specific ideas based on what she had seen in Billings, including a pattern she had noticed in guest feedback that nobody at Billings had bothered to trace to its origin. Loyalty members who had their room upgraded were 3 times more likely to rebook within 90 days. Not because of the upgrade itself, but because the staff member who delivered the upgrade news almost always used the guest's first name and referenced something specific about their previous stay. It was not the room, it was the recognition. She brought this to her team. Reese Calloway listened with his arms crossed and his head tilted in the particular way of someone deciding whether an idea was worth absorbing. Then he nodded slowly. "That's actually a strong insight," he said. "It fits what I've been thinking about personalization as a driver." He tapped his pen on the table. "I'll incorporate that into the framework section." Soren said, "I can write up the data from Billings directly. I have the feedback records." "Great," Reese said. "Send those over. I'll synthesize everything into the executive summary." She sent them over. That evening, she opened the shared document to add context to her data section and discovered that her name had been moved to a subheading marked Supporting Research and Operational Notes. The framework section, which contained her core idea worded in the language of strategy rather than experience, was listed under Reese Calloway's name alone. She sat with the laptop open for a long time without typing. She had seen this happen before. Not to her, but she had watched it happen to other people, and she had told herself that if it ever happened to her, she would say something directly and early before the silence became the record. So the next morning, before orientation began, she found Reese near the coffee station. "I noticed the document was reorganized," she said. "My analysis ended up in the supporting notes section." Reese looked at her with an expression that was not defensive, which somehow made it worse. "I restructured for clarity," he said. "Your Billings data is in there, it's just framed for a leadership audience." "My analysis built the framework," she said. He shrugged, barely. "Soren, it's a team project. Leadership synthesis matters. That's what the program is looking for." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I'm not asking for extra credit," she said. "I'm asking not to be made invisible." Reese's expression shifted slightly. Not guilt, exactly. More like a recalibration, the look of someone who had expected less resistance. "Just don't make this a bigger thing than it is," he said quietly, and turned back to his coffee. Jolene Farr chose that morning to announce that Thursday evening would include a welcome reception for trainees and senior property staff. "Formal but relaxed," she said. "An opportunity to connect with leadership." Soren wrote it in her notebook and underlined it twice, less out of excitement and more because she understood exactly what the sentence meant. It meant a room full of people performing the version of themselves they hoped would be remembered. She was right. Thursday evening, the conference room had been rearranged to accommodate tall tables, platters of food, and the particular atmosphere of professional socializing, which resembles actual socializing the way a studio set resembles a real house. The trainees moved in clusters. Patrick Hollis, the assistant general manager, worked the room with the smooth efficiency of someone who had practiced this. Jolene stayed near the senior staff. Reese Calloway found the VP of Guest Experience, a silver-haired woman named Constance Ogilvy, within 11 minutes of the event starting and had been near her elbow ever since. Soren stood at the edge of the room with a glass of sparkling water she had not touched and listened to Reese presenting her framework to Constance Ogilvy. He was describing personalization as a loyalty driver. He mentioned Billings once, briefly, as a regional data point. He did not mention where the Billings data had come from or who had identified the pattern. Soren set down her glass. She crossed the room and arrived at the edge of the small circle around Reese and Constance Ogilvy. "That pattern in the Billings data," she said, "comes from tracking guest rebooking rates against specific staff interactions at check-in. I compiled those records from 2 years of working front desk there." Constance Ogilvy turned toward her with genuine interest. "You worked Billings? What was the direct correlation you saw?" "Recognition," Soren said, "not upgrades. When a staff member referenced something specific from a guest's history during check-in, rebooking rates tripled within 90 days. The upgrade was a vehicle. The personalization was the product." Constance nodded slowly. "That's a more precise articulation than I've heard." Reese smiled. "Soren has great field instincts," he said. "I help translate them for a strategy audience." Constance looked between them. Soren held still. It was Patrick Hollis who chose that moment to call across the room, not loudly but clearly enough. "Ed, can you clear some of those plates before the table fills up?" Ed Ferris was near the far wall collecting used napkins from a side table. He moved toward the center of the room with a tray. A moment later, One of the trainees, a tall young man named Brooks who had been watching the Reese-Soren exchange with amusement, reached over and placed a nearly full cocktail glass directly on the tray without asking, the way people place things on surfaces they have decided belong to someone else's work. The glass tipped. Red wine spread across the pale floor in a slow, dark arc. Everyone stepped back. Patrick Hollis sighed audibly. Reese glanced toward Adrian. "Ed, you might want to move faster on that." Adrian set down the tray and reached for the cleanup supplies. Brooks added, more quietly, but still audible in the way things said in a quiet room always are, "Try not to stain the carpet worse than it already is." A few people made sounds that were not quite laughs. Soren moved before she finished deciding to. She crouched down at the edge of the spill and began pressing napkins against the leading edge of the stain while Adrian worked from the center. He looked over at her once, immediately. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She pressed the napkin down and held it. A shard of glass she had not seen caught the heel of her palm. She made a sharp sound, not loud, and pressed her hand flat against the floor. "Hey." Adrian was beside her immediately. He took her hand gently, but without hesitation, the way someone moves when they have forgotten they are supposed to be playing a role. He pressed a clean cloth from his cart against the cut. "Hold that," he said. His voice was quiet and direct in the way of someone used to making decisions in the middle of things. Soren looked at him. The angle was close and the light at the far end of the room was warmer than the rest of the space, and in that moment, looking at Ed Ferris's face, she had a thought she could not fully explain. He looked at the cut on her hand as if it mattered more than anything else currently happening in the room. Not like an employee concerned about liability. Like a person who was genuinely, specifically worried about her. "I'm okay," she said. "You're bleeding," he said, which she noticed was not the same thing as saying she was fine. She stood slowly. Reese had already turned back to Constance Ogilvy. Patrick Hollis was speaking quietly to a server near the door. The moment with the wine glass had already folded itself into the background of the evening. Nobody was looking at her except Adrian, who was still holding the cloth against her palm with careful steadiness. Soren looked at Reese and then at Patrick, and then, with her voice slightly unsteady but clear, said, "It would have been easy for everyone to help clean that up, and it would have taken 30 seconds. But it's been 3 days, and I've noticed that the work nobody wants to do always lands on the same people. That's not a logistics problem, it's a culture problem." The room was quiet for one full breath. Patrick Hollis turned from the door. "Soren, this isn't the appropriate venue for that kind of comment." His tone was measured, the careful register of management addressing an emotional employee. "Let's keep the evening positive." "I am being positive," she said. "I'm describing something that can be fixed." Patrick looked at her the way people look at something they have decided to manage rather than hear. "We can follow up in a more appropriate setting," he said, which meant they would not. Soren walked out of the reception without finishing her water. The next morning at 7:52, a calendar invitation appeared in her inbox. Patrick Hollis HR debrief 8:15. No subject line, no description. She walked into his office at 8:14. He had a file on his desk she recognized as her trainee intake form. A note had been appended to the digital header. She could read the first line from where she sat. Emotional regulation concern. Flag for assessment. Patrick opened with a compliment, as she suspected he would. "Soren, your technical background is genuinely strong. The data from Billings has real value, then the turn, but last night raised questions about professional composure. Leadership programs require people who can manage difficult moments without making others uncomfortable." "I was direct," she said. "That's not the same as lacking composure." Patrick's voice stayed even. "I want to be transparent. There's a pathway to complete the program if you can demonstrate you've processed this. But if there are ongoing concerns about fit, it may be worth considering whether this is the right cohort timing." She understood what he was offering, a quiet exit framed as a mutual decision. She thought about Becca's tuition. She thought about the shared document with her name buried in the footnotes. She thought about Estelle Price, whose name she did not know yet and would not know for weeks, but whose situation she had half recognized the moment she arrived at this property, because she had worked in enough low-crest hallways to understand the shape of a system that rewards people for looking good instead of doing good. "I'm not withdrawing," she said. Patrick nodded slowly, carefully neutral, noted. She left his office and walked to the stairwell and sat on the third step from the bottom because the lobby was too public and the bathroom was too small. She sat with her bandaged hand resting on her knee and her eyes fixed on the concrete wall, and told herself that she had made the right choice, even though the right choice was also the harder one, and nobody in that building seemed to understand why those two things should not be different. The door opened. Ed Ferris came through carrying a small first aid kit and a bottle of water, and she looked at him and said, "Do you follow everyone to their worst moments, or just me?" He sat down on the step below hers, leaving appropriate space. "How's the hand?" "It's fine," she paused. "I didn't get the sense that he was going to fix anything." "No," Adrian said, "he's not." She looked at him sideways. "How long have you worked here?" "Long enough," he said, which was not an answer. She noticed he gave a lot of replies that were technically responses without being answers, the way people speak when they know more than they are saying. "Were you ever in management?" she asked. Adrian looked at the narrow rectangle of light the stairwell window let in. "I've been responsible for decisions that affected a lot of people," he said, "and for a long time I assumed the right reports would tell me whether those decisions were working." He paused. "They don't. Reports tell you what people are willing to put in writing." Soren studied him for a moment, the pale square on his wrist where a watch had been worn for years, the way he sat not like someone resting, like someone who had chosen to be exactly here with a specific purpose. "Ed," she said slowly, "I don't think you're a maintenance associate." He looked at her directly for the first time that day. "I think," she continued quietly, "that whoever you actually are, you've been watching this whole week, and I think you saw what happened last night." A beat of silence. "I did," he said. "Is it going to matter?" He stood slowly. He picked up the first aid kit. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully name except that it contained something that was not pity, because pity looks downward, and whatever this was looked straight across. "Yes," he said, "it's going to matter." Then he pushed through the door and was gone. By noon, Adrian was no longer only watching. In the property's security office, using his override credentials, he reviewed the camera footage from Thursday evening. He watched Brooks tip the glass. He watched Patrick Hollis look at Soren and choose to correct her instead of Reese. He watched the moment Soren crouched to clean up a spill nobody else moved toward. He watched himself press the cloth against her hand and stay there. By 2 in the afternoon, he had accessed the version history of the shared team project document, every edit, every timestamp. Soren Avery's name had appeared in 14 separate sections of the original draft. After Reese Calloway's 11:45 edit on Tuesday night, her name appeared in 2. Her framework, her language, her data from Billings, all intact, all attributed to Reese. By 4, he had pulled Estelle Price's personnel file and read her HR complaint, submitted 9 months ago, reviewed by Patrick Hollis, marked as reviewed and no action required, and sealed inside a folder nobody had opened since. He had also found 2 other complaints from housekeeping staff, filed in the previous 18 months, given the same treatment. He sat in the security office for a long time looking at those 3 sealed complaints. Contained, that was what they had been. 3 people who had told the truth and been filed away inside a system designed to absorb the truth and hold it still until it stopped mattering. Adrian thought about what he had built, the revenue numbers, the expansion timelines, the press releases about Low Crest's commitment to its people. He had read those press releases and believed them in the way you believe something, when you have never been in the rooms where the opposite is happening. Friday morning, the project presentation. The conference room was set up for an audience of senior property staff, regional leadership, and 3 members of Adrian's corporate executive team who had flown in from Denver headquarters for the quarterly review. They sat along one side of the table. The trainees presented from a small lectern near the screen. Jolene Farr introduced each team. Rhys Calloway went to the lectern first for Group 3. His slides were clean and structured. He described the loyalty framework with confidence. He mentioned Billings twice as a source of field data, without mentioning where the field data had originated. He spoke about personalization as a retention strategy, and used 3 phrases that Soren had written word for word in the original draft. The regional VP, a careful man named Gil Thornton, leaned forward. "Mr. Calloway, what was the specific mechanism you identified in the billings data? Walk me through how you traced rebookings to the interaction type." Reese paused, a real pause, not a rhetorical one. "We analyzed the rebooking rates in relation to loyalty upgrade touchpoints," he said. "What was the interaction type?" Gil Thornton asked again. Another pause. "The data showed a correlation with personalized service delivery." It was not wrong. It was also not the answer, and Gil Thornton knew it. Soren stood up from the second row. "Soren," Jolene's voice carried a note of warning. "Questions come after." "I need to add something to the presentation," Soren said, and her voice was not steady, it was clear, which is a different thing. She looked at Gil Thornton directly. "The billings data was mine. I worked the front desk at Low Crest Billings for 2 years. The correlation I found was specific. When staff referenced something from a guest's prior stay during check-in, and I mean specifically, not generally, rebookings within 90 days tripled. Not because of upgrades, because guests felt seen. I built that framework before I arrived in Denver, and I compiled the supporting data from my own records. My name was removed from the primary analysis in a Tuesday night edit I did not authorize." The room went quiet. "That's a strong claim," Patrick Hollis said from the side of the table, his voice tight and careful. "It's a documented one," Soren said. The door at the back of the room opened. Ed Ferris walked in wearing his gray maintenance uniform, and several people turned with the automatic annoyance of people interrupted by staff entering at the wrong moment. Patrick Hollis started to say something. Adrian removed his name badge and set it on the corner of the nearest table. He kept walking to the front of the room. "My name is not Ed Ferris," he said. The room produced a particular silence, the kind that arrives when the air pressure changes. "My name is Adrian Lowe. I am the founder and CEO of Low Crest Hospitality." Rhys Calloway's pen dropped to the table. Patrick Hollis's face went a color Adrian recognized as the specific shade of professional terror. Gil Thornton leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone whose suspicions have just been confirmed. Adrian connected his own device to the room's display system. He pulled up the document version history. Every edit visible, every timestamp, every name added and removed. He pulled up the camera footage from Thursday evening. He did not narrate it. He let the room watch Brooks tip the glass, watch Reese turn back to the VP while Soren crouched on the floor, watch Patrick Hollis correct Soren for speaking up rather than addressing what she had said. Then he pulled up Estelle Price's HR complaint, and the 2 that came before it, and the notes that said reviewed and sealed. "I spent a week in this building," Adrian said, "because a woman named Estelle Price wrote me a 3-page letter by hand and told me she did not know if this company still had a heart." He paused. She was more generous in her framing than the situation deserved. Nobody spoke. He looked at Rhys Calloway. Using someone else's work and someone else's 2 years of experience as anonymous scaffolding for your own name is not strategy. It is not leadership synthesis. It is taking something that does not belong to you and calling it initiative. Rhys looked at the table. Adrian looked at Patrick Hollis. "You received 3 complaints from frontline staff in 18 months and sealed all 3. Effective today, you are suspended pending investigation. You will have no access to personnel files or HR systems until that review is complete." Patrick opened his mouth and closed it. Then Adrian turned toward the second row, where Soren Avery was standing with her bandaged hand at her side and her chin slightly up in the way of someone bracing for whatever came next. "Miss Avery," he said, "would you finish the presentation?" She stood very still for one breath. Then she walked to the lectern, and she did not look at Reese, and she did not look at Patrick, and she did not look at Adrian. She looked at the room. She explained the framework the way she had built it. Not the polished executive version, the real one, the one that started with 2 years of early mornings behind a front desk in Montana and a pattern she had noticed because she paid attention to the people nobody had thought to ask. She explained the mechanism in detail that made Gil Thornton take 3 pages of notes. She described the implementation steps she had already drafted and what the pilot metrics would need to look like to confirm the hypothesis at scale. Her voice shook once, near the beginning. After that, it did not. When she finished, the room was quieter than rooms usually are after a presentation. Then Gil Thornton started asking questions, and the questions were specific and serious, and Soren Avery answered every one of them. What followed was not a single transformation. Adrian knew better than to tell that story about himself or about Lowcrest. Real change is slower and less satisfying than the version you announce at a press conference. What he could do was make sure the machinery of the company stopped absorbing the truth and holding it still. The investigation found what he expected it to find. 2 of the 3 sealed complaints were substantiated. Patrick Hollis resigned before the process reached its formal conclusion. A new interim general manager was brought in from the Austin property, where the guest satisfaction scores had been consistently high and the staff turnover had been unusually low, and Adrian took some time to consider what the combination of those 2 facts might mean about management style. Estelle Price returned from a family leave she had been pressured into taking 6 weeks before Adrian's visit. He met with her directly in a small conference room, just the 2 of them. She seemed surprised that he had come in person, and then unsurprised in the way of someone who has long suspected the world of being less attentive than it claims, but is pleasantly willing to be corrected. "I didn't know if you'd read the letter," she said. "I read every word," he said. She nodded once, as if that was enough. Rhys Calloway was removed from the leadership track. He was offered a continuation in the standard operations training path with a different team structure. He took it. Adrian was told he had been quieter since the presentations, which was not a rehabilitation, but it was a beginning. The loyalty program pilot launched 8 weeks later in 4 properties, including Billings. At the 90-day review, rebooking rates in the pilot group were up 18% compared to the control group. Gil Thornton wrote a 1-paragraph summary to the board that credited the framework by name. The name on the framework was Soren Avery. She had been hired as an operations analyst 3 weeks after the presentations, based on the recommendation of the regional VP and the assessment scores she had earned through the course of the program. Adrian had not been in the room when the decision was made. He had made sure of that specifically. But he had been thinking about her since the stairwell, about the way she had said "you're bleeding" is not the same thing as "you're fine." About the fact that she had figured out who he actually was before he told her, which meant she had been paying attention to him while everyone else was looking through him. About the evening near the Riverwalk, 2 weeks after the presentations, when they had ended up at the same outdoor table at a coffee place near the property, by what started as coincidence and became something else. Over about an hour and a half of conversation, neither of them tried to end early. He had told her about the original letter from Estelle, about the divorce 4 years ago that had left him in an apartment 2 blocks from the office, surrounded by the particular silence of a life that had been reduced to work and had not yet figured out how to expand again. About the way the week in the gray uniform had felt, honestly, less like an investigation and more like the first time in years he had been inside his own company instead of above it. She had told him about Becca, about the scholarship and the housing gap and the calculation she had been running in the back of her mind for months, about the fact that she had grown up in a family where you did not ask for things without having already figured out how to be useful in return, which she understood was a learned behavior and not a virtue, but which she also was not sure she wanted to fully unlearn. He had listened until the coffee was cold. The boundary she set was simple and non-negotiable. At work he was the CEO and she was an analyst in a regional operations role, and that distinction stayed clean. Outside of work there were no titles and no caveats, and neither of them pretended there were. He respected it the way you respect a thing that is both a boundary and a definition, something that tells you who a person actually is. One afternoon, months later, he was walking through the lobby of the Denver property, and he passed the framed executive portrait near the main entrance, the one that had hung there for years that people walked past the way they walked past fire extinguishers. Someone had repositioned it slightly. It now hung directly across from the door of the employee break room, in the sight line of the housekeeping station, so that the people who came and went from the parts of the building nobody photographs could see it every day. He stood in front of it for a moment, a man in a regular suit on a regular Tuesday morning, and a housekeeper he did not recognize passed behind him with a cart, glanced at the portrait, then at him, and said, "Oh, you look just like him." "I get that sometimes," he said. She smiled and continued down the hall. He watched her go and thought about a woman in a stairwell who had looked at him directly and said, "I don't think you are who you're pretending to be," and had not seemed afraid of whatever the answer might be. He thought about what it means to build something large enough that you stop fitting inside it, and what it costs to find your way back in. He thought about Estelle Price's letter, the handwriting gone slightly uneven at the bottom of the last page, and the question she had asked without asking it, whether the company still had a heart. He was still working on the answer, but for the first time in a long time, he believed it was the right question. I keep thinking about the sign Soren moved out of Adrian's way on that first morning. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't wait to see if anyone was watching. She just saw something in someone's path and moved it, and then went back to her phone. That's it. That was the whole thing, and somehow that small, unremarked gesture set in motion everything that followed. I've thought a lot about why that is, and I keep arriving at the same place. What we do when nobody important is watching is not a separate version of who we are. It is exactly who we are. Soren didn't know she was being observed by the person who owned the company. She wasn't performing decency for an audience. She was just being herself, consistently, in a building full of people who had decided that consistency of character was less useful than consistency of impression management. That gap between who a person actually is and who they perform themselves to be when it matters is where things go wrong in organizations, in relationships, in any system built on trust. Rhys Calloway was not a monster. That's the part I find most instructive and most uncomfortable. He was someone who had learned correctly that credit accumulates to the person who frames the idea rather than the person who had it. He had learned that lesson somewhere before this story even started, probably many times, and nobody had ever given him a real reason to unlearn it. That's not an excuse, but it is a cause, and causes matter if you actually want to change outcomes rather than just punish people after the fact. What I notice about Soren is that she carried three things simultaneously that most people let cancel each other out. She had a clear understanding of what was right. She had the analytical intelligence to see exactly what was happening and why, and she had the steadiness to keep going when the system pushed back, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a current moves, the way pressure builds. She told Patrick Hollis she was not withdrawing. She sat in a concrete stairwell with a bandaged hand and did not talk herself into accepting less than what was true. That kind of endurance is not stubbornness. It is a practiced refusal to let a difficult environment teach you that you were wrong about yourself. Adrian's failure was not cruelty, it was distance. He had built something large enough that the honest information could no longer reach him through normal channels, so he stopped receiving it. The reports said the culture was healthy, the bars on the slide went up and to the right, and 3 handwritten complaints sat sealed in a folder that nobody reopened because the system had been designed, without anyone quite deciding to design it that way, to protect its own surface. What Estelle Price's letter actually gave him was not information. It was a reason to go look for himself. I think about that sometimes when I'm reading a summary of something I should probably be seeing directly. A summary is someone else's decision about what matters, and the things that most need to change are almost never the things that make it into summaries. They are in the stairwells, in the sealed folders, in the small moments where one person moves a sign and another person notices. The cause and the effect are not always close together in time. Soren moved a sign on a Monday morning. The framework she built from 2 years of paying attention to the people nobody thought to ask changed rebooking rates across 4 properties 8 weeks after she was nearly pushed out. Adrian read a letter written by hand because someone did not know what else to do, and that letter became the reason an entire HR process was rebuilt. None of those outcomes were guaranteed, but all of them were possible because each person chose to be, at the moment it mattered, exactly who they actually were. That's the only version of success I trust anymore.